Lisa is the Northern Rockies Association Conservation Director for American Rivers and has done some really interesting work on the topic we're talking about today. With can logging and river protection be compatible? And I think she has a slightly updated title on her title slide, which she will share. So with that, without further ado, please go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Taylor. Much appreciated. And thanks so much, folks, for your interest in this topic. Um, what I'm going to share with you today is the culmination of some research that American Rivers has done over the last year or so, loosely in collaboration with the Flathead National Forest, with a lot of help from the forest. And it is titled, the title that you see on the screen, Protecting Rivers While Cutting Trees. And I think this is an interesting topic that I doubt I'm the only person asking this question. And it's a question around compatibility. And so that I want you to keep this in mind as I speak today. This is sort of what drove this research. And if you leave here with one thing today, it's this notion of compatibility, and in this world that we live in now of division and extremes, where we're seeing the ends of the spectrum pitted against one another. I'm presenting research tonight that shows us that the middle gray between those extremes is larger and richer than we might have imagined when it comes to bridging the gap between forest management and river protection. So I want to set the stage a little bit by acknowledging that river protection and land management sit in a very interesting political time. There are a lot of different forces pulling on land management and land managers. And I've listed some of them here. Some of them pull in a way that increases our management on public lands. Some pull in ways that decrease our management on public lands. These are all different social, political, economic, and scientific factors, and there are a lot of them. And so acknowledging that this is often where forest management finds itself, in this tough place where it's being pulled in a couple different directions, right? When we have a lot of competing needs and competing priorities and different forces in the world. And one thing at American Rivers that I have experienced in my work, and that I know a variety of my advocacy colleagues have as well, is this perception that river protection and forest management on public lands are incompatible. And specifically when it comes to things like fire mitigation, restoration, and road construction or things related to roads post-discovery. And so we wanted to learn, like, is this really true? Because we're hearing this from a variety of different sources, from a bunch of different places. And so that's leading us to ask ourselves, like, can we really not have our cake and eat it too here? And I think we're asking this because we acknowledge that both of these values, protecting rivers and cutting trees and harvesting timber, are equally important multiple use values on our multiple use lands. So now we get into a little more of the details of the research. So when we look at these two forces of river protection and forest management, we're specifically looking at wild and scenic river protection, specifically on the Flathead Wild and Scenic River in Montana. And when we talk about forest management, we're talking specifically about cutting trees and shrubs, so cutting down stuff and burning things, which are generally, if you boil them down to the most layman terms, those are sort of the two things that constitute fire mitigation. So why wild and scenic rivers? I've listed out here a variety of different, I'm not going to call them designations, but they're land management, legal and administrative, and practice things that affect rivers on public lands. Some of them are at the state level, some of them are federal. And I think what distinguishes wild and scenic rivers in this list, particularly designated rivers, is that of all of these things that I have listed, it is one of the few that creates an actual management unit on the landscape so that we have a polygon to work with. And that's important when I start describing here shortly the research that we decided to do. Little bit of background for those who are maybe less familiar with wild and scenic rivers. These are all of the wild and scenic rivers that are designated in our country currently. There are 228 that encompass a little over 13,000 miles. Contrast that with the number of dams. There are 90,000 dams and 10,000 low-head dams. So in comparison, wild and scenic rivers are pretty scarce. When we look at Montana specifically, we have three or five, depends if you count the Three Forks of the Flathead as three, then you have five. If you count them as one, then you have three. So either way, three or five rivers in the state of Montana, and I'm also showing here several in Idaho. They're just over the border from where I live. Our research takes place on these two segments. So the bottom circle that you see is the recreational section of the South Fork, which flows from the Bob Marshall Wilderness into the slack water of Hungry Horse Dam. The top circle is your North Fork, your scenic and recreational segments. They flow from the Canadian border south and confluence with the Middle Fork near Columbia Falls, Montana. And you can see the colors. Wild and scenic rivers are classified according to their riverside level of development and access. And so we're specifically looking at two of the three categorizations here. So zooming in even a little bit further, this is our South Fork section. So the bottom circle on the previous slide. This is your actual wild and scenic river boundary. And you'll see when you look at the boundary that, yes, it is pretty far from civilization. However, there are some development aspects to this landscape. There's an airstrip, there's a ranger station, outfitter ranches, campground. There's a variety of infrastructure that exists either within or shortly outside of the Wild and Scenic River corridor. In general, when we look at these scenic and recreational categories, there are a variety of things that you can do in these wild and scenic river segments. And listed at the bottom, we have vegetation management and prescribed burning are both activities that we know from Forest Service policy are allowed to take place within scenic and recreationally classified wild and scenic rivers. And so specifically, we're looking at what can we learn from the 50 years of forest management history that we have on the Flathead Wild and Scenic River. So our research took the Forest Service facts database and we clipped all of the activities that have happened between the designation of the Flathead in 1976 and 2025, so 50 years worth of time. And we analyzed across that 50-year time frame what has happened within this wild and scenic river corridor and what can we learn from that. So overall, on this segment of the South Fork, it represents about 4,000 acres of different projects over time and portions of 16 different projects. So I want to start out our research before I sort of get to some of the conclusions and the conclusive maps. I want to take a tour, which is illustrative of some of the different sites within this river corridor. So we're going to tour some trees now. This is one section of the South Fork. This is a section that has had multiple different treatments. It's one of the more highly treated and highly managed portions of the South Fork. It's kind of at the tail end. So if you can see I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but this is the campground loop. And can you all see my cursor, Nancy? Yes. Okay, great.
Yes, we
So
can.
this is the campground loop here. You know, we have the ranger station is kind of over here just outside the boundary. This is an outfitter camp right here. So the star is where this picture on this left side here, so this picture over here, was taken in the fall of 2025. And if we look at the facts database, these things listed below are the treatments, the forest management treatments that have happened over the last 50 years within that exact spot. So in the summer of 2000, this was commercially thinned. There were undesirable lodgepole pines and spruce and subalpine fir trees of marketable value that were cut to improve the growth and the vigor of the remaining ponderosas, as well as a couple other species. Then the following spring, there was a jackpot burn to burn some of the downed branches, both from the thinning as well as those occurring naturally. In the spring of 2023, there was a ponderosa pine planting. And then for more than a decade, the stands here sort of were untouched and they were regenerating. In the fall, there was a pre-commercial thin of 2015 where some of the smaller trees without commercial value were cut. And then fast forward from 2015 to today to 2025, so another 10 years, and this is what you see after that time frame. All right, so next stop on our tour is meant to contrast what you just saw. So this is an area that has been lightly managed. You can see the forest looks different here, right? You don't have to be a silviculturist to see that like the trees look different here. They are closer together. There's less diversity in terms of size and in terms of species. They look a little bit more homogeneous. And this is an area that was had two pre-commercial thins in 1999 and 2014 in a different area of this same corridor. So it's kind of where we were before was kind of over here. This is like across the river, on the other side, kind of kitty corner. The next stop on our tour showcases some of the legacy of forest management prior to 50 years ago, or prior to the designation of the river. So prior to the designation of the Flathead. And so this is this right here that you see is the airstrip. And then this is a section in which you can probably see from the satellite imagery, or you may be able to see from the satellite imagery, that this looks a little bit like a thumbprint. And this has some of the legacy of clear cutting and roller planting that happened sequentially, followed by some different treatments after designation, including a pre-commercial thin in 2014. And so you can still see today in 2025, even many, many years later, that you can still see these rows from the roller planting, that they're kind of like carrots and they're a little too close together still. And so I think this is interesting because, if your Wild Scenic River has been designated for a long time, you may have the legacy of long ago management. That can also be true if your Wild Scenic River is more recent, right? So the decisions that we make on the landscape to manage have a long-lasting effect, and this is one of the places where we see that on the Flathead. The next step in our tour, we're sitting on the road. In this particular area, the road marks the boundary between what is inside the river corridor technically and what is outside. And you can see that there's this section here that I'm tracing that kind of looks like a dog with a really excited tail here. There's two polygons. This one here is inside the river corridor. This one here is outside the river corridor. In the picture, the left side of the road, what's on the left side is what's inside the river corridor. So that's the river side is this here. So this is interesting because you can see some of the differences and some of the similarities between management inside the river corridor and management outside the river corridor. You can see again on the screen, a variety of different treatments took place here in this particular polygon, and one of those we'll talk about a little bit later. And I think this might be our last step in the tour. So this is an interesting spot because this is one example of how decisions that get made in forest management outside the Wild and Scenic River Corridor can be influenced by the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So what you see on the screen here, this star is where this photo was taken. The photo is taken looking this way at the hillside behind. So you can see, I'm tracing them again with my cursor. You can kind of see here is one, polygon. Here's kind of another, there's a third one that kind of goes down like this. And so if I sort of trace them out on the landscape, these are two of the treatments that happened in these spots, noting that, the treatments happened and the decisions that were made about what types of treatments to make were influenced by the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, because this is such a noteworthy vantage point on the road in which you have a beautiful vista on the sort of end of this gooseneck of the Flathead River. And so, the decisions that were made about how to treat the forest technically just outside that boundary, those decisions are influenced by what can be seen from within the Wild and Scenic boundary. Okay, and I lied. We have one more stop on the trip here. So this is one spot. There's a spur road here that leads to sort of a clearing and some other pieces. And what I did want to show, since I did show a seed tree cut in the previous slide that occurred outside the Wild and Scenic River corridor, this is an example of one that has occurred inside the Wild and Scenic River corridor in this polygon. So you kind of see it, the picture is taken from right here, and this is a section. So, what does this tour tell us about forest management? One of the conclusions from this research is that active forest management occurs inside Wild and Scenic River corridors, and that the full suite of management tools remains available to land managers, meaning that just because we're inside the Wild and Scenic River corridor doesn't all of a sudden mean that we categorically exclude any particular treatments. Just listing out those that I showed in the examples on our tour, these are the different types of cutting that you saw, burning, and planting. So a lot of different types of active forest management, not just a handful or a truncated list. So getting more into some of the conclusions from our research. So we took all of these activities that happened within the South Fork River corridor. We categorized them grossly into 4 different categories. So cutting, burning, planting, and removing invasive species. Again, as a way to condense and make understandable a lot of the incredible detail that is contained within the Forest Service facts database. This facts database has hundreds of thousands of records over, many, many, many years, many decades of all of the forest management activities that the Forest Service has completed anywhere, throughout all time. So a lot of detail, a lot of complexity, and again, trying to make some sense of this in order to be able to explain these concepts broadly, not only to folks who are familiar with forest management, but also to folks who are not. So if we grossly categorize these things and then we plot them over time by acreage, this is generally what you see happening in that section of the Wild and Scenic River corridor over time. So you see some things here. This is a snippet in time. You see that this is well after logging on public lands largely hit its heyday, which is sort of in like the mid 1900s, right? We're sort of just shortly after that. This is shortly after like your national environmental policy changes, right? So this is after like NEPA, Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, Wilderness Act, et cetera. The history that we know in which there was a profound change in the way that people in America thought about public lands and the evolution of our modern conservation movement. The majority of Montana timber mills closed in sort of like the 1990s to 1999, and again, some more closing in the early 2000s. So you see some of that in here as well. You see a focus in the 2010s on invasive species controls, which I think is something that happened across Region 1 of the Forest Service, probably elsewhere, more of a focus on your invasive species control. This is also sort of a snippet in which you see a small fraction of time in which timber cycles exist, right? Timber cycles exist on a longer time frame, but if you think about them sort of in the context of thinking about your garden as a metaphor for our timber cycles, you plant it, you thin it out when it gets too thick, you let it grow, and then you can harvest it at some point. And when we think about how that applies to timber, the time frame is just much greater than a summer, much greater than 3 months. But that is can be a useful analogy in thinking about growth and maturity cycles of timber. So just to provide a little clarity as to sort of what is included in one of these categories, at least. So the cutting category includes what is considered to be pre and post harvest. So stuff you do before and after logging, and then your primary harvest techniques. So your pre and post harvest are things like, your chipping, your slashing, your mastication, those types of activities. Your primary harvest techniques are the different types of cuts. These are, listed in alphabetical order, and not in any other, not any other level of meaning, but you see that there's a lot of different types of cuts. The facts database has, again, a lot of detail in it, so we are condensing that down into this cutting category, which includes both those pre and post harvest techniques as well as your primary harvest methods. And if you take what you saw in the graph and then you plot it geographically, this is what you get. And the years that you see next to the polygons are the years of completion listed in the facts database. And again, we have the same categories: cutting, burning, planting, and the removing of invasives. So if you kind of think about, slapping these two on top of one another, it's going to look a little bit like a flip book, right? If you sort of flip through it, you're going to see like a variety of different cutting, burning, planting, and removing invasives happening repeatedly on the same pieces of ground throughout time if you sort of ran this as a movie, a little flip book movie. So to provide a little bit greater detail, this is about 9 river miles long. And if you, again, sort of pull out from that cutting category, some different categorization of how you might group together types of cuts. There are 23 commercial thins, so types of cutting that fit into this sort of we cut the least amount of trees category. There are 7 other types of selective cuts that fall into this middle ground category of cutting a moderate amount of trees, and then 13 seed tree or clear cuts that fall into this category of cutting the most trees. And then lastly, here are the last 2 maps. The green is your planting map. The purple is your removing invasive species map. So I think one of the conclusions that I definitely draw here is that within this river corridor, there's not much that's not been touched, right? This has been a heavily managed space over the course of time. And yet you saw during our tour, depending on your perspective, a lot of those forests look very natural. They look very good from a layman's perspective if you look at it through the eyes of someone who's recreating on the forest. They look pleasant when you view, when you view them. So you might assume that just because the South Fork is pretty remote, so again, the South Fork is down here. This is kind of where you have Kalispell and Columbia Falls is up here. You might assume that just because the South Fork is really remote, that, harvest there occurs more. And you would be at least partially right. But we also did some analysis on the North Fork looking at spaces that were more proximate to development and to civilization. And so this is one of those maps. This is about kind of like right here, that upper portion. And so you can see that cutting and burning and forest management does take place not only in remote lands, but also occurs proximate to private lands within the WUI. This is just south of that. So this is the north, and then you're just flowing into the south here. So again, another section on the North Fork that has been heavily managed over the years. So I want to return to this slide here, this picture. We saw this on the tour a few minutes ago. This is the West Side Road, so it's this sort of part between this road that marks sort of the difference between what's inside versus outside the river corridor. And we know from policy that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act has a moderating effect on things that happen in the river corridor to make sure that we don't degrade river values. And in this particular spot, if you'll remember from the tour, we did a cutting in 1980, a planting in 1981. There was a pre-commercial thin in 1999. And in 2010, as part of the Spotted Bear Vista project, there was a commercial thin and some vista clearing that happened. So again, this is 15 years prior to this picture being taken. And we wanted to look sort of within some policy documents as part of our policy analysis that accompanied the GIS portion of this to see, what that moderating effect looks like in policy analysis. So this is a quote from the decision memo from the Spotted Bear Vista project, and I've highlighted some relevant quotes here to illustrate how this particular site is an example of a project that was designed to enhance scenic and recreational outstandingly remarkable values. So our metrics for management with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act are that we can't degrade the values, we can maintain them, or we can enhance them. And so I think it's important to point out an example of where we enhance them and why. So treatment objective is to increase diversity of forest conditions along a roadside, providing a more appealing foreground viewing experience for the driver, opening up the tunnel effect. So recognition that vehicle-based recreation is a legitimate form of recreational ORV, not just being on the river, that's relevant to the Flathead River here. Treatments will allow easy access to a magnificent viewpoint high above the South Fork River. I pointed out earlier that one of our conclusions is that all of the toolbox still remains available to river managers in the context of forest management. But we did want to look a little closer at some of the differences that might occur, the differences and the similarities that occur between what's inside the river corridor versus what's outside. Knowing that, from a policy standpoint, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act has a moderating effect on everything that takes place because we have to accommodate, we have to maintain or enhance these outstandingly remarkable values. So this is a quote from one of the other projects in which we see that proposed treatments are intended to improve stand health and probability of survival during beetle infestation while retaining more trees than other similar units proposed outside of the Wild and Scenic River corridor to meet a variety of different goals. So we know that there can be differences, and the treatment intensity differences reflect desired conditions and ORV considerations, but not categorical exclusions. So these next set of maps that I'm going to present take a look at treatments inside and outside the river corridor. This next set of maps is limited exclusively to primary harvest techniques only. So this does not include your yarding, mastication, clipping, chipping, things like that are pre and post harvest techniques. And we met with current and former foresters to try to categorize, again, a lot of complexity related to different types of harvest techniques listed within facts. So we're loosely categorizing these into three different categories of least amount of trees, moderate amount of trees, most amount of trees. And you can see the different types of activities from the facts database that I have listed here and what category those are listed in. And so if we map that, we map these activities. Again, this is your activities between 1976 and present. Your primary harvest techniques only, categorized according to least, more, or most trees. So your least amount of trees is in orange, more trees red, most trees pink. The colors on the map are transparent. So where you see darker of the same color, that's an additive value, meaning that there were multiple activities, again, layered on top of one another as we go through time. So the innermost boundary that you see, the darker blue, is your Wild and Scenic River corridor, and there's a 1 mile buffer. We're looking at everything 1 mile outside of that. I'm going to toggle between these because the South Fork runs north and south, and a PowerPoint slide runs horizontally, so they don't fit terribly well. So this is your bottom half. So top half, bottom half. We'll go back to the top half for a second here. So I think it's interesting to note that in some cases you do see differences, right? You see differences between treatments inside versus outside the river corridor. In other places you don't. In other places they are the same, or they're the same sort of category. So there isn't a sort of a very definitive distinction between what happens inside the river corridor and what happens outside, which I think is illustrative of the full toolbox being available and the differences being defined by desired conditions and ORV considerations. Same maps here, limited to burning. So looking at complementary burning versus treatment burning. So your complementary burning are things like burning your slash piles and other types of burning that often happens in conjunction with other types of harvest versus your primary burns that are intended for prescribed burning. You see a few more differences here again, but also not definitive. So this does bring us to a kind of a final list of conclusions from this work. You've seen the first two that I'll repeat again. You know that active management occurs within wild and scenic rivers. The types of active management are diverse, and that full suite of management tools remains available to land managers. Treatment intensities that you saw in this last set of maps reflect differences in desired conditions and river value considerations, not a categorical exclusion of any particular type of forest management. And I think that's important. And lastly, that protecting river values occurs when you have dedicated Forest Service staff that are committed to balancing the need to protect rivers and cut trees, recognizing that those are both important multiple use values, and having dedicated staff that are committed to that balancing act and to that compromise. And I want to talk a little bit more about that last piece. I think in a variety of conversations that were part of this research with current and former agency staff, it really became clear that agency culture plays a really important role in determining the quality of forest management that happens, as well as the quality of river protection that happens. And we tried to boil down some of what we heard through a variety of conversations to some sort of, I would say, maybe best practices from a cultural standpoint. These ideal elements are things that help promote this culture of compatibility and compromise. So those things include these vocal, well-trained veteran specialists. So obviously when you have a lot of turnover, when you have staff that don't stay long, that can be detrimental to decision-making, not just for rivers, but for forest management as well. And this includes not just your fish biologists and your hydrologists, but your silviculturists as well. And when these people have a high degree of trust bestowed on them from their line officers, who are the ultimate decision makers, you get high quality, productive teams. These teams tend to be proactive and collaborative and coordinative in nature, with highly engaged project leaders who are very attentive and pull in necessary specialists when necessary. These teams are committed to a positive problem-solving attitude. So approaching these tensions between forest management and river protection with a what's possible mentality to resolve conflicts and recognize that that sort of compromise is necessary to achieve different types of goals. And lastly, when you have continuity and conformity, these things result when values and ways of thinking are institutionalized across staff within these teams and across specialties. And then they're passed down to successors when you have staff turnover. So when you have a strong culture that is passed down through succession, then you have new folks that come onto the team who are institutionalized into this way of thinking, this type of culture perpetuates itself over multiple generations of different staff. So I want to lastly touch on, what we're doing with this work. Like, how is this work actually like being used, and what are some of the, conversations and places that are happening as a result of it? So I'm showing a picture here of me and a couple of folks from Flathead Rivers Alliance in DC in March. So in addition to my role at American Rivers, I chair the Wild and Scenic Rivers Coalition, of which Flathead Rivers Alliance and a whole host of other river-specific partners nationwide are part. And every March, we all gather up our luggage and we put on our best clothes. We try to look good, and we go to DC and we talk to our congressional leaders about the importance of river management and river protection in the places that we live. And I was blessed to have Pat Van Imeren, who's a former Forest Service biologist from the Flathead National Forest, who also serves on the board of Flathead Rivers Alliance, to accompany me and talk through this research with our congressional representatives from the state of Montana, as well as House and Senate Natural Resource Committees. So the reception there was quite good. I think in Congress right now, where Republican politics are driving decision-making around land management, this is a concept that is resonating well. It is one that I have seen, be welcomed in a variety of spaces, from the Society of American Foresters to other private forestry companies. So it is, I think, a concept that is resonating well outside the conservation movement. As a specific example, this is just a snippet from a recent project that is making its way through the NEPA process on the Flathead National Forest. It's called the Granite Moccasin Project, and it's a variety of treatments, some of which are proposed within the Wild and Scenic River corridor. And one of the roles that I am starting to play as a result of doing this research is as an advisor to my environmental colleagues when they are in positions of advocacy, commenting on or participating in public comment periods. And so in looking at this, this new project that is proposed, as you can see, a lot of the same types of treatments are listed here on the screen. And so I am able to bring forth what I learn to help advise my colleagues on where and how to comment and to be effective in their public advocacy on different types of timber projects. And I think just one last thought that I will share before we take questions here in the last 10 minutes or so is that, first of all, I see you here, Coulter, and I just want to acknowledge how helpful the Flathead National Forest has been with this research, and really recognize the value of the cultural pieces that I mentioned a couple slides back. And that does leave me a little fearful for the future, in terms of recognizing the very direct correlation between the quality of our forest and river management and the capacity of our federal agencies. Um, as many of you, I'm sure many of you obviously share that concern, and I think this research has put a fine point on that in terms of how it affects the nexus between timber management and river protection. So with that, we have about 10 minutes left, and I would be happy to take questions. I have put on the screen the URL for our report, and I can also just paste that in the chat here as well. If you go to americanrivers.org/reports, you can download the full report that has all the text, the executive summary, all of the maps, etc. It also has a story map which tours some of the sites that I showed and is public. So I would welcome feedback from this group and would welcome any questions at this time.
Thank you, Lisa. I don't know if it's a question or a comment, Lisa, but just thinking about the intent of a project too. When you have something that's really focused on restoration, or you have something focused on commercial timber harvest, and just thinking about that in the context of a wild and scenic river, I just wonder what any discussions have been happening about that. Any thoughts or insight you have on especially new managers, trying to think that through because we have a lot of new folks that are trying to
Sure.
understand this.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think we undertook this research I think largely because we were sort of feeling pushback against the typical policy response that we had, which was like, sure, of course you can do forest management in wild and scenic river corridors. The Forest Service policy says so. Like that should be good enough. And it wasn't good enough, right? And so I think what this brings to the table, and what we hope to do perhaps with other issues like restoration, is it makes it very real. I can say now definitively, like, this thing happened in this particular place on this particular year. And, certainly our report looks beyond that in terms of, like the analysis piece. We do some like analysis, obviously, of like, forest management over time. But I think just that component of having some very specific examples of this compatibility has gone a long way to educating and dispelling. My sense is that we often perhaps defer to what we know. And I think the wilderness movement has done an incredibly powerful job of institutionalizing a certain way of thinking about how to manage land. And that is, again, from my wilderness background, I will very, very, very extremely simplify this as sort of we say no first, and then you convince us to say yes, right? Whereas I think this research looks at it from a different lens. And certainly within wild and scenic river corridors, that is very, very appropriate, to approach it from like, we always say no, and we have sort of a culture of no mentality. I think one is not productive in the current political climate. Two, it does not align with Forest Service policy. And three, it doesn't align with this research in terms of, the evidence of compatibility that we've been able to, to present. So, I mean, I guess, my advice then to sort of new managers and folks who may be less familiar with wild and scenic rivers is to encourage you obviously to just learn a little bit more about where you have that latitude of gray in the middle, and I think you'll discover that you have quite a bit of it. And if you can proactively engage your teams and your leaders and start to build that culture, it's not a culture of no or a culture of yes, it's a culture of, well, let's try and see what we can do together. I think that's the glue that makes these things possible and that makes us able to say that yes, we can have compatibility between forest management and river protection. And, sure, we may need to make some tweaks here and there to achieve that, but it's with that mentality of let's do something together that we're able to have that conversation instead of cutting it off from the get-go. Does that make sense,
Yeah,
what I just said,
it
and
does make a
kind of
lot
kind
of
of
sense.
somewhat answer your question at least?
Yeah, and it was maybe more of a musing or a comment more than
Yeah.
anything of just thinking about, yeah, just pressures that are becoming more, acute
Yep.
and things like that for
Yep,
people.
the trade-offs are becoming harder, and I think we are also seeing, this research has presented a model I think that we've seen work well enough, and the dividends have been great enough to want to apply it to other issues like restoration or like road building and road maintenance within a wild and scenic river corridor, things of that nature. I think
Mhm.
we have, presented a sort of case study, case studies in a particular place in a compelling way that we're interested in applying this same model to different issues that we know kind of have that same tension.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate that.